For those of us who are in the chronic disease world and we're struggling with chronic disease and maybe we're on the other side finally, we've become disillusioned with the conventional care model that is in place today. What happens when you are inside that model for years and then become disillusioned? What does that look like? How do you try to change it? Where do you go from there once you've realized how horrible the system is and how it's really just sick care and not health care? That is what our guest today is going to walk us through. Graham Atkinson is an amazing man, and he is pharmacologically trained. He was high up in the UK government-run healthcare and became disillusioned. And today he's going to share with us his story, what he's learned, and where he's going from here. It is an incredible interview you are not going to want to miss. He has so much wisdom to impart with us today, and I'm so excited to introduce you to him. Welcome to the Therapeutic Food Solutions podcast. I'm your host, Mary Mitchell. I'm an integrative nutrition health coach, therapeutic diet expert, and founder of The Road to Living Whole. There are many different diets out there. It's hard to know which one is right for you with your chronic illness and autoimmune disease. In this podcast, I'm going to share with you the foundational pieces every single therapeutic diet out there shares, and also how to use the best one for your particular diagnosis. If you've been looking for a meal planning partner, help navigating the complicated healthcare system, and want to feel better quickly, I'm your girl. Grab your kombucha and notebook. Let's dive in. Thank you so much for joining us today. Let's go ahead and dive into who you are and your story and what kind of brought you to the holistic health side of things.
Well, thank you, Marion. I've got the tingles already. I'm somebody who gets tingles when the truth appears in the room, shall we say? So it started already, which is lovely. So thank you for the invitation. I'm delighted to be speaking with you and your audience. So yeah, so who am I? I guess I was the archetypal system guy. I was born in the UK in 1965. I qualified as a pharmacist in 1988, and I went down the sort of traditional sort of high street chemist, high street pharmacy route for a good 15 years. I then joined the National Health Service in the UK, so the NHS. And for a good 15 more years, I was a director of commissioning. So my role was to essentially performance manage the whole healthcare system in my area for populations of a 250,000 up to nearly 500,000 people. And that was everything from primary care, community care, to emergency care in hospitals, cancer services, specialist tertiary services, and everything in between. It was a whole system, including public health. We then had a change of government in the UK and things got shaken up a bit, and I chose to leave because I didn't really like the direction of travel. And I spent 3 years working as a consultant for the pharmaceutical industry around London, which opened my eyes somewhat further. We can come back to this, I'm sure. After 3 years of that, I'd had enough, and I rejoined the NHS in a more local role. I'm a change agent at heart. I love making change for the betterment of people, and I was still searching for the place where I could actually bring about change. So I'd tried nationally and regionally and not really got very far. So I went back to my roots locally and had some success locally. And I was headhunted, if you like, by a local general practice, by the doctors, and I joined them as a business manager in 2019 and became a partner in the business, because general practices here, even though they're part of the NHS, they're still an independent business. So I actually invested in the business just basically as the COVID, let's call it a pandemic for now, arrived. And I was properly scared for about 4 weeks. Until I realised I'd been hoodwinked and my NHS programming had kicked in, and I just followed the national message, if you like, done what I was expected to do. But once I started looking at the data, I started challenging the system, challenging my clinicians, and the more I looked, the more I found that said we weren't experiencing a pandemic at all. And the more I did this, the more I was opposed, essentially. And to cut a very long story short, after about a year and a half, we had a big fallout and I decided to walk away. And for the last year and a half now, I've been focusing on the future and focusing on, let's say, true healthcare, and the replacement of the allopathic system with what went before it, essentially. All those good natural holistic healthcare modalities that were taught in universities until about 1913. So that's my focus now, Marion. And yeah, so we can dive in wherever you like. But I'm essentially a system guy that, let's say, woke up, had an awakening, fairly painful awakening in parts, but it did happen over many years. I was gradually, probably from about 2010 onwards, I was starting to see the cracks in the system. But yes, but I'm fully outside the system now. I've got no interest in it at all. I'm able to speak my truth and the truth, which I greatly enjoy.
I feel like that's a lot of our stories, right? Is we come into like this mainstream allopathic conventional model and we trust it, but then we start seeing the cracks. And then over time, we just realize that none of it really works,
Mm, yeah,
especially not when it comes to actual health. When it comes to trauma, accidents, stitching people back together, all of that, it's great. But when it comes to actual health,
yeah.
the current system doesn't work. And I love your story. It was definitely a condensed version. Maybe we can talk about more. I mean, the pandemic was a breaking point, right? But what was it about that really was what was the catalyst that brought you to just completely shift from what you were trained in to holistic health? And, where have you gone with
Mm.
that?
Yeah. So I suppose my gradual, if you like, revealing of the cracks probably started in, as I say, 2010, when I realised that the healthcare system actually isn't about health, and it's a business, it's a money making business, and I realised that the politicians in the UK, and it's probably the same in most countries, I'd kind of seen them as, let's just say they're stupid, they don't understand healthcare, and they're being misguided. I then realised, because I had a national role, I then realised they weren't misguided. There was an agenda. And I initially thought it was an agenda all about money, and there was just, big pharma, big food, and they were being lobbied very hard, and they were just doing what the lobbyists said. And then I realised it's actually not just that, it's something bigger. There is something else at play, and it didn't really, I couldn't see it back in 2010. I lost my own gut health in sort of 2015, 2016, and I started doing my own primary research together with my wife, who's also a pharmacist. And the two of us had an amazing 2 or 3 years where we were running diabetes recovery clinics for type 2 diabetics, and we were just helping them understand what their condition actually is and what it isn't, and helping them to remove the labels that had been applied to their foreheads by their doctor. And we were reversing their type 2 diabetes. So we were, I mean, my wife didn't lose her health, I did. And so I recovered my own health, if you like, and then I helped to share that knowledge. So that taught me that most of the guidance in the healthcare system is actually rubbish as well. The food guidance and I was chairing committees in the NHS. I was chairing drug advisory committees for many years. So I was the guy sat in the committee of pharmacists and doctors, and we were looking at, primary research, new drugs, looking at the evidence, deciding whether that drug worked and whether we were going to fund it in the local system. So I was very adept at reading primary research. But I'd also been trained as in the UK, what we call a gold commander. So if there is a national emergency, I was one of the poor people who would be locked in a bunker for, uh, a long time, along with the army and the, other important people, and we would be running the country from a bunker. So when the pandemic, and I'll call it a plandemic, when that arrived, initially my NHS programming kicked in, and I saw my role as to help my practice. I mean, we had 25 doctors, 150 staff, 25,000 patients. I saw it as my role to help guide everybody through what was, I really believed, was the 1 in 100 year pandemic. And I briefed everybody, made quite a few people cry, expected probably 2, maybe up to 5 doctors to die. We expected 500 patients to die. And this was sort of mid-March 2020. And then by early April, I'd realised that any of our patients who'd been admitted to our local COVID ward, and we're talking people well into their 80s and even their 90s, they're admitted to the COVID ward and then they came home a week later, perfectly fine. We had a care home with outbreaks of COVID in care homes, and we expected everybody to die. Nobody died. So I started then questioning the national message. And quite quickly, I realised the government was lying to us as well, because I realised straight away that many of the tried and trusted treatments for respiratory conditions were actually being withheld from patients, and any clinicians that wanted to use them were being sanctioned. And that even applied to things like vitamin D and vitamin C therapy. And our own health minister here in the UK made a statement in our parliament about vitamin D not being effective in COVID. And the very next day, he had to go back and correct the official record of Parliament because he'd actually misled Parliament. And I knew then we were dealing with liars. And I then realised that there was something much darker at play here. It was not just a case of we've fallen in line and the country has been misled. It's actually something much darker. And I then had a real dilemma, because I thought, well, I can't openly say that with my colleagues. I've got to share enough of my doubts, and in order to try and help them see what I could see. So I set about presenting data. I'm a bit of a data nerd, and I was pulling data out of our own practice system. I was pulling data off the government websites, and I was presenting it to the doctors. And as far as I could, well, to anybody who was independently minded, the data showed that we'd already got past the peak. And this was in early April. And I continued to do this all the way through the summer of 2020. And as the autumn of 2020 appeared or neared, we were approaching our second lockdown in the UK. So I set about speaking a bit more aggressively, if you like, because I really didn't want the practice to be locked down again. Because what I was saying to my GPs was that the lockdown is actually killing more of our patients than so-called COVID, and I could prove that. People who couldn't get access to healthcare, either in our practice or in the hospital, were dying at home. It was already happening. And that all fell on deaf ears, and I was told to quieten myself, to toe the line, and not bring attention to the practice as being in any way difficult. So I considered leaving. This was the autumn of 2020. I really wanted to just walk away, which was not easy because as a partner I was bought in, and I was persuaded to stay by my family and by people who knew that I was trying to change the system. There were people, truth seekers, who said, look, we need you on the inside. So I said, fine, I will stay on the inside. And my next task was to open a COVID vaccine centre. So we opened a COVID vaccine centre, and I was the accountable operational director for the vaccine centre. I genuinely thought we wouldn't get much of a take-up in the vaccines, because I'd already briefed my GPs about how potentially dangerous they were, as even just the modality, the new delivery platform, I think is the phrase in the pharmaceutical industry. Never been used before in humans, untried, untested, emergency use authorization. How far, how much do you need to say, to say that from a pharmaceutical perspective, these are not tried and tested, and they're potentially not safe and could be a lot worse. That all fell on deaf ears, and our uptake was about 99% in the over 65 patients. And it absolutely broke my heart, Marianne. I was on the door watching these people come in. It was the middle of winter. They had snow on the shoulders. They were shivering. And we had 5 patients who were over 100 walk into our practice and get their COVID vaccines. And what really hurt my heart was that it obviously meant so much to them. This was their ticket to freedom, because they'd been in self-imposed prison in their own houses for about 9 months at this point, and they thought this was their ticket for life to go back to normal. And I knew it was anything but that. So at that point, my physical and mental health started to take a turn for the worse. The only way I could survive in my role was to completely compartmentalize my work from my home life. And I actually identified work as being in the matrix. And I literally saw myself from the movie, literally dialing into the Matrix every day, playing a role in a fictional reality, and then leaving that fictional reality and going back to my normal life. And that was the only way I could stay sane. And things gradually got worse. I was still desperately trying to change things for the better for my patients and my staff. And eventually it got to the point where my partners voted, they had a vote of no confidence in me and voted me out. And I said, well, fine, I'm leaving anyway. And we parted ways at the end of October 21. Yeah, so that's maybe a longer answer than you wanted, but that's so my awakening was quite painful, but it was just so obvious to me. And what stupefies me to this day is how little the average person can see of what is obvious to me.
I cannot imagine how stressful that was and the toll that that took on your health mentally, physically, emotionally, all of that. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think that it's,
Pleasure.
you know, like like my brain is just like you're basically all that training that you had from 1988 to then, like that's a that's a huge shift and that's stressful. And on top of everything
Mm,
else, I want to go back to the type 2 diabetes and how you reverse
mm.
that. And I know that I feel really strongly about how that is the gateway to other diseases. And I think that I would love to dive more into that and the role that we can
Sure.
insulin resistance and all of that plays in overall health.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, I'm a system guy, was a system guy. I was a pharmacist. I was taught that the human body is a bag of chemicals, and that's it. It's that we have drugs, we have receptors, we have metabolic processes, we have enzymes, and we're just a bag of chemicals. I now know that's a small part of the whole truth, and that as human beings, we are so much more than just a bag of chemicals, and we can maybe go into that. But at the time that I was going into reversing diabetes, I was approaching it from a chemical, biology point of view. So I mean, the health advice for diabetics in the UK, type 2 anyway, is you need to eat your carbohydrates. And and even for type 1s, you titrate your dose of insulin based on how many carbohydrates you've had today. And I kind of went with this, but my cognitive dissonance really pricked my awareness probably in about 2013, 14. And it was when I was working as a pharmaceutical consultant, and I think I got one job working for a drug company making a new, one of the very latest type 2 anti-diabetic drugs. And I was thinking, this is just not correct. This whole model of load yourself up with carbs and then use drugs to reduce the carbs, that's just so counterintuitive. So started doing my own homework, and with my wife, we looked at it, and you realize that actually nearly all of the health advice, never mind the treatment advice for type 2 diabetics, is 180
Yeah.
degrees wrong. So we set up something quite, we just called them low carb clinics, something fairly inoffensive to most people. And they were really popular with patients. And the doctors and the nurses in the practice, they loved them because it was an outlet for these difficult patients that they didn't know what to do with. And we said, well, we'll take them off your hands. And we were running
Hmm.
sort of night school classes, group classes, and educating people in sort of holistic health. We did a bit broader than just low carb. We did talk about healthy sleep and reducing stress and having the right nutrients and the absence of toxins. So we did go a bit broader, but we didn't go into things like grounding and synchronizing your body with the light cycles in your area, and reducing EMFs and all those sorts of things. That came later. But we were tremendously successful, and we managed to get quite a few people their code of diabetes removed from their health records. So they were no longer type 2 diabetic, and they came off all their meds.
That's amazing.
And yeah, but it's not hard to do. I mean, we're talking 4 to 6 weeks in some cases
Right.
for people who've been diabetic for years. And
Yeah.
they just looked so much better when they came in, after a couple of months. And we then got these patients to become expert patients and train the next cohort. So we just sort of set up a rolling program, if you like. So that all worked very, very well. The main obstacle we had was with dietitians.
Mhm.
uh, which may not surprise you.
Nope, not a surprise at all.
No, we could, I'm sure most of your listeners will probably know how dietitians are trained and who funds the training and where all that comes from. But we were both attacked by dietitians saying we were doing something that was dangerous. We were presenting them with data saying we've reversed type 2 diabetes, and they were attacking us for harming patients with this untried, untested, diet, which was, very interesting. So we had early success with type 2 diabetes, and then we kept researching, and we sort of binge read and researched loads of great doctors out there. There's loads of American doctors. I mean, Ben Bickman, Sean Baker. You've got Gary Fettke in Australia. Tim Noakes. All these. We were very well read on all of these doctors, and we became much more aware of metabolic syndrome as being, and I see it as a gateway. I mean, if your body's not metabolically functioning well, and that's not just about the chemicals, is it? It's about lots of other things which you could probably touch on.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Let's talk about metabolic syndrome. What is that defined as? And then what goes into that, and how does it run optimally? What does it need?
Yeah, so I mean, if I just start by saying many of the diseases that are categorized in the allopathic system, I see as many years downstream of metabolic dysfunction.
Mm-hmm.
So there's metabolic dysfunction. So when your body starts to not work optimally in a metabolic fashion, so we're talking about principally the mitochondria in your cells. Hopefully your listeners will know what I'm talking about here. The little energy factories in most of your cells. If they are not working optimally, you start running out of energy. It's almost like you're a battery, and your battery starts going flat, and you won't feel that at all. Probably for many years, your body's very good at compensating for that, and it will find ways of mitigating the lack of energy. And it's many years, maybe decades further down the line, that you will start to get what we call symptoms. And the allopathic system loves symptoms because it then gives them a label and a code, which is called a disease. And then the treatment is a drug or surgery or both. And that's how the allopathic system works. So, but if we could just go back to the time when your body starts to be suboptimal from a metabolic point of view, if we could freeze time there and start to put in place the core parts of what will help your body to work optimally, which, I mean, obviously diet and nutrition is a significant part of that. And I would say that the diet that is right is the one that works for you. And we're all different, we're all individual, we all come from different parts of the world. And I think in a very general sense, if you eat whole food, and if you eat food that comes from your area, it's local and it's also in season, I think those are all very important things. And I think if your grandparents or your great grandparents would recognize the food you're eating and buy it in a shop, that's a good sign. If your grandparents wouldn't recognize it as food, then it probably isn't food, and it's what many people call a food-like substance, which is wrapped in plastic and has a barcode on it. So avoiding food-like substances and eating whole food, and whatever's right for your ancestral mitochondria, because I think, I don't know too much about this, but I think that we've essentially got 7 different types of mitochondria on the planet. They're inherited down our maternal line, and there's much less variation in mitochondrial DNA than there is in nuclear DNA. So if you're like me, I'm generally a sort of Northern European. I know that I come from the northwest of Europe. If I was to move to Japan and start eating Japanese local food, I would probably start to struggle. So I think eating ancestrally what's right for you, even if that's different from what's available locally, is probably a key to it as well. There's so many facets to this. I mean, so if you think of yourself as a battery, I've come to greatly admire the work of Dr. Jack Kruse. Are you familiar with Jack Kruse?
I'm not. Mm-mm.
So he's American doctor, Dr. Jack Kruse, and he's done some amazing work on light.
Okay.
And the fact that, I'm very inclined to believe now that as humans, our batteries, if you like, what we're doing is we're holding light. Literally, we're holding photons. So, and those photons come, I mean, every food on the planet has come from the sun, hasn't it? So plants are grown from photons, animals eat plants. So it doesn't matter whether you eat plants or animals, everything's come from the sun. So the information encoded in the food you eat has come from the sun. And I think we have, our mitochondria are part of the system that helps us absorb and maximize the light in our bodies. And the more light we can hold, the healthier we are. So I think when we run out of photons and our batteries decline and we start to manifest symptoms, and then we get given disease labels, and it's a slow descent into polypharmacy. Multiple drugs. You get the first drug, your first drug will mask the symptoms, and you and the doctor say, "Oh, it worked." Well, no, it didn't actually. It just stopped the symptoms, and something else is going to manifest next, and then you get the second drug and third drug, etc. So,
Yeah.
and I've seen in my career as a pharmacist, I've seen the time when people's health declines to the point where they, if you like, submit to pharmacy and pharmaceuticals. I've seen that age come down, probably from the sort of mid-60s to, in some cases, the mid-30s. You see people in their mid-30s on several drugs, and they look 10, 15, 20 years older than they actually are.
Yeah.
And it's very sad, isn't it? So I think, and there's lots of causes for that. We could talk about Ansel Keys and the trans fats and all that sort of dark, poor. Well, it wasn't poor, was it? It was an intentional misleading of the Western population to believe that fat is bad for you, and to hide the fact that sugar is actually bad for you.
Yeah.
So a lot of the people I see on the high street consuming these drugs, they've just been misled. And to this day, I still believe we can help a lot of them if we can reach them and give them some very simple, understandable information about this thing that we would call metabolic dysfunction, which leads to hyperinsulinemia. So your body will secrete more and more insulin to cope with the carbohydrates that you're eating and increasingly can't metabolize. And the greater levels of insulin then cause other diseases. I mean, cancers, breast cancer cells have got way more insulin receptors than the normal breast cells, and it's probably a good 80% of all diseases could be taken back to this hyperinsulinemia, to the metabolic dysfunction, and ultimately to the gut. And maybe we'll come on to gut health, because I think it was Hippocrates said that everything starts in the gut. All diseases start there.
Yeah.
And certainly that was true with me. Lose your gut health and you're going to struggle, aren't you?
Well, yeah. And I feel like modern first world culture really does destroy gut health. The overuse of antibiotics, especially in childhood, childhood with, ear infections and things, which can be linked to
Yes.
vaccinations and, things like that. And vaccinations have been linked to dysbiosis and truly altering, gut health. But then we also have toxins that are sprayed in the air and sprayed on the food. And so we just have this onslaught for our gut health and the microbiome that's there. And then, as you kind of talked about this too, we're like stress and sleep and things, right? So we have all the light pollution, which, negatively impacts sleep, and people not spending time outside and all this stuff that plays a role in just disease. And I think what I love that you stress is like, yeah, it is metabolic dysfunction, but then the next domino is insulin resistance, or, the hyperinsulation. What did you call it?
So hyperinsulinemia. So
That
it's
one.
it's an elevated level of insulin in the blood, which then many years later leads to insulin resistance,
Right.
which is the tissues in the body stop responding to insulin.
And that's happening younger and younger. That used to be an
Yes.
adult disease that's now coming into childhood.
Yeah. Well, I'm old enough, Marianne, to type 2 diabetes when I first qualified as a pharmacist was called maturity onset diabetes or sugar diabetes.
Yeah.
There's a clue there, isn't there? But it's not maturity onset diabetes anymore. We're getting teenagers or even 8 and 9-year-olds with type 2 diabetes. It's extremely sad. But it
Yeah.
is this modern, hypertoxic environment that we live in, and like you say, it's the water, it's the air, it's the light pollution, the EMFs, it's the food, it's the glyphosate in almost all produced manufactured foods, and it's very hard to escape from. But I did go through a phase of being really quite scared by the future, if you like,
Hmm.
and seeing it as very inevitable that we were going to succumb to all of this. But I've come to believe that the human body is an amazing, I mean, it's an amazing creation, let's say that. And I believe our bodies can heal anything if we give if we give our bodies the right tools to do so. So I now believe that there is only one disease, which is this metabolic dysfunction. You can leave all the labels that the doctors have learnt. You can leave those at your front door, or leave them in the doctor's consulting room, certainly. And all you need to do is focus on your metabolic health, and that really is a product of an absence of stress, and that's stress of all kinds. It's mental and emotional stress, but it's also physical traumas. It could be traumas in your childhood that you haven't resolved. It could even be traumas in your parents' lives while you were in the womb, or even before you were conceived. I think I'm now a great believer in intergenerational stresses that are passed down.
Hmm.
Finding ways to address things in your life that have caused you stress. And I've been doing this repeatedly over the last 2 or 3 years, and I'm remembering things that I'd forgotten that even made me stressed. But I think that's my body saying, right, you're now ready to deal with this, Graham. We've hidden this away in your head for 40 years, but the conditions are now right for you to deal with this. So here it is. And of course, you remember it, and you feel, oh, why am I thinking, about this today? But it's because your body, you should see it as a good sign. Your body's having faith in you that you can restore your health with dealing with that trauma. So stress, I think, is a big one. And then it's the presence of all of the right nutrition in your body, and that goes, from the proteins, the fats, not so many carbohydrates, but we have essential proteins, we have essential fats. There are no essential carbohydrates.
Well, I do want to
Uh,
point out, because I think that people might question, like, because they think, oh, macros are so important, but proteins can be converted into carbohydrates if the body needs them.
yes,
So
yeah,
carbohydrates are non-essential. Truly, we need the protein, we need the fat, but carbohydrates are
yeah,
non-essential.
yes. So in fact, the analogy I used with my doctors at work, my GPs, because they believed your body can make anything out of anything. And I said, sorry, that's not quite the case. The reason we have essential amino acids, essential proteins, if you like, is because our body can't make them, so we need to eat them. And we have essential fats, exactly the same, but there are no essential carbohydrates. Um, so if you're looking to make something, let's use an analogy of a bridge. You're the construction company, and you need all the right bits of steel and concrete and bits of wood and all the rest of it. But if you don't get supplied with all of the essential bits, and they send some substitute bits in their place, and you just stick them all together and hope that it works, your bridge isn't going to last very long. But that's what the body does. It will always substitute in your tissues something that's fairly close to the essential component that is missing, and it will get you by for a while. I mean, you can ask orthopedic surgeons about the ligaments that they see, in people who've eaten, lots of PUFAs and the wrong types of fats. The ligaments are a different color, and they're not as strong. So the body will still make a ligament, it will still make connective tissue and cartilage, etc., but it won't do the job as well. So the presence of essential nutrients is absolutely key. I used to be a competitive cyclist and athlete, and I used to live on carbohydrates. I used to eat sugar, sugar, sugar. It was
The
drummed into
athletic
me.
diet, like long
Yeah,
distance
yeah,
runner diet, marathon diet, all of
yeah.
that. Yeah.
Well, exactly. Well, I became a long distance runner, and I started doing ultra marathons, and I was training for a 5 day ultra marathon that was about 10 hours per day through the Welsh mountains. And this was at the time I was recovering my gut health, and I started, maybe I don't need carbohydrates. Maybe my body can make energy from fat, and if I need sugar, it will make the sugar, the glucose that I need. And actually, I don't need that much glucose because my heart runs on fat. So, your heart runs on butyrate, on fat. It doesn't run on glucose. Your brain mostly runs on butyrate, on fat, bit of glucose. And what I discovered, Mariam, was I could run fasted. I could wake up and not have breakfast, and I could run fasted for about 5 hours.
Which is crazy.
And this was just crazy. And yeah, and I was used to eating carbohydrates every 20 minutes. So that was a massive revelation to me that the human body. So I actually put on one of these continuous glucose monitors.
Hmm.
So I wore one for a month because I'd gone to a carnivore diet, which,
Hmm.
not for everybody, but I'd gone full carnivore. And to this day, I've hardly eaten any fruit or vegetables for about 5, 6 years now. And my blood glucose is absolutely flat. It doesn't matter what I
It
eat,
stays
my
at
blood
baseline no matter what.
it's on the boat, and it's actually at a level that the doctors would be concerned about. They'd say you're actually hypoglycemic. You've got too little blood sugar. You're going to pass out. We need to give you some Gatorade or whatever. Here's some sugar because you're in danger of falling over. And of course I haven't. In that 5 or 6 years, and I did quite well in my race actually for my age. And so the fat powered Graham was my superpower because I watched everybody around me eating all their carbohydrates and having
The
their full
little
sugar Cokes
and the gels,
and their
the sports
gels.
the sports gels. Yeah.
Yeah, and I watched them get headaches. I watched them be violently sick, and I watched them, have a spurt and then crash. So they would overtake me, then I would overtake them, and then they'd come back. And at the end of the day, they were way behind me. And the fat powered Graham, did very well. So that taught me a lot. So the presence of the right macros and micronutrients, your minerals, your vitamins, all of that's super important. And the more I read about this, I mean, magnesium. I think we all know about magnesium.
Hmm.
We probably know. I mean, do you talk about iodine supplementation at
I
all?
have not talked about that at all, so let's hear
Right.
it.
Okay. So I think we are all deficient in iodine. The whole iodine story is very interesting. The iodine in the chemical, the periodic table, it's a halide. So iodine, chlorine, fluorine, bromine are all in the same chemical group. So if your body hasn't got enough iodine, a bit like we were saying about the bridge, it will find another element from that group and use that instead. So it'll use chlorine. So we are surrounded by chlorine, aren't we? It's everywhere.
Everywhere.
Increasingly, we're surrounded by bromine. Bromine is everywhere. And so what happens is our thyroid uses these, the chlorine and the fluorine and the bromine as substitutes for iodine. And our thyroid hormones don't work properly. And the doctors say, well, you've got hypothyroidism, you've got Hashimoto's, or you might have thyroid cancer. And of course, the treatment is a drug, and
Right.
the treatment is never iodine. In fact, we're taught to fear iodine, which is, and it's a bit like the Ansel Keys story and fat. Iodine has been demonized, and I would say it's been demonized on purpose for a reason, which is to make us chronically unwell. Boron is another one.
Yeah.
Boron is essential for human health. It did used to be, I mean, all these things were available in our soils and in our plants, but they've been depleted from the soils over the last 100 years.
Yeah,
You know,
modern farming practices, the
yeah,
non-rotating, the lack of manure, the lack of blood meal, the lack of
exactly.
biodiversity has really
Yeah,
done us a huge disservice.
it has. So all of these micronutrients are missing from our soils, so we need to put them back. So iodine, bromine are big ones. Iodine is huge for women's health,
Hmm.
whether it's hypothyroidism or hyperthyroidism, the menopausal symptoms, breast cancer, ovarian, and gynecological issues. Iodine is almost always implicated in all of those. So I'm trying to remember the name of the book. There's a book called The Iodine Crisis, which I think you can get as a free PDF download. It's an amazing read, and it is just full of case studies of people who've used iodine. So the original doctor who used iodine is Professor Lugol. So you may be familiar with Lugol's iodine.
Hmm.
So Lugol used very high doses of iodine, doses that modern doctors would say are extremely toxic, and they're not at all. So if people want to look into iodine, I would say go with caution because what happens is when you start supplementing with iodine, your body will replace the chlorine, the fluorine, the bromine with iodine. What then happens is the chlorine, fluorine, bromine end up in your blood, and you start to feel quite unwell until you've passed them out in your urine. So the way to deal with that sort of nauseating feeling is to drink salt water and just flush them out. But I'd say go slowly. There are protocols out there if people want to look into it. But iodine is very essential. So the three pillars, if you like. So it's stress, it's nutrition, the absence of the presence of the right nutrients, and then the third one is the absence of toxins, which is tricky, isn't it?
Quite difficult.
Yeah. And one thing I've learned, Marianne, is that, rather than seeking to add something to make yourself more healthy, think about something you can take away. So we've all got very complex, busy lives. Rather than reaching for the next magic thing on the shelf, think about, well, what could I take away that is not helping my body? And that may be a food that you really like, but it's not serving you, it's not helping you. It may be your Wi-Fi router at night. It may be the blue light, your iPhone or your TV computer screen after it's gone dark. It could be lots of things, but just try one thing and give it a week, and then be honest with yourself. How does my body feel? And one thing I've learned to do is tune much more into my body, and say, okay, if I'm really honest, how do I feel about this now?
To kind of jump in there, a lot of people have been taught not to trust their body.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is they're so used to feeling bad that they don't notice when they feel good.
Yes, correct.
So usually what happens is people start making changes, and then they revert or fall off the wagon, whatever people want to call it. And then they feel awful and they go, wow, I didn't realize how good I was feeling. So the journey to learning how to listen to your body does take time. So I just kind of wanted to interject there that sometimes you won't recognize when you're feeling better until you do something that makes you feel worse.
Absolutely.
So I wanted to kind of health coach that in there a little bit.
Definitely, 100%, Aaron. I mean, that was my experience with the sort of going carnivore, if you like, because I think I'd seen it as the ultimate elimination diet, because I couldn't work out what it was that wasn't working for me. So I thought, well, let's just take everything out and eat eggs and steak, and I kind of went on a steak and egg diet for about a month. And then you add one thing back in, don't you? So, well, I'll try, red kidney beans. Do you call them kidney beans in the US?
We do, yes.
Yeah. So, and I learned very quickly, no, they do not suit me. I immediately knew, and I'm getting very good at this now. I can almost, if something's in my mouth within a minute or two, I know. I get a buzz in my head. I used to have to wait several hours, and I've got some gut pains, but my body's getting, or maybe I'm getting much better at listening to the messages that were always there, but I couldn't hear them.
Yeah, no, I have had that same experience. Elimination diets are quite powerful, and people tend to, there's different theories on, whether they're good or bad and everything, and how long to do them and things like that. But I think the most important thing is if you eliminate, you have to make sure whatever you're including is super nutrient dense,
Correct.
and again, with, I think Northern Europeans do a lot better on like high fat, high protein diets. I'm Northern European myself, and I do thrive on that type of diet with a lot more protein, a lot more fat, and a lot less carbs, versus somebody from Asian descent, would probably not do as well. But yeah, like the power of elimination, but to also make sure we're getting all those nutrients at the same time, which is what you made sure to do. And I also find that most modern first world countries and stuff are super protein deficient. We're told that, 46 grams RDA is all you need, which is just enough to not die. It's not even nearly enough to even remotely thrive. I think they found the bare minimum for women, and I'm assuming that the woman's like 5 foot tall, like I am, is like the bare minimum is 80, right? And then there's research showing that the bare minimum is 100, and then for men, it goes way up from there. And so I think a lot of what happens is we're just so deficient in amino acids and the minerals that come in protein. People think that protein is, animal-based protein is just amino acids, when it's literally super mineral dense. And we get vitamin A, which people are also really scared of, but it's essential for immune regulation. And all of that. The great thing about the elimination diet is you are able to quickly see how poorly something makes you feel.
Yes, yes, and I think you reminded me of a good point there. And what I've learned over the last few years is that there is just vitamin A isn't one thing. There is the animal vitamin A, and there are plant vitamin A equivalents. And even if you are eating, let's say, a plant full of vitamin A, your body will have to convert it into the human vitamin A equivalent, and that may need trace minerals or elements like copper or manganese or something like that. The enzymes that do that might rely on something tiny, and if you haven't got those in abundance, then you're not going to be able to convert the plant vitamin into the animal active vitamin. So I'm not an expert on those. I'm sure you could tell me a lot about those things, but it's something I learnt, which explains why some people's whole food
Yeah.
diet doesn't work for them. And we're probably getting into the sort of gut dysbiosis and the microbiome, because I think the microbes in our gut actually do a lot of that pre-processing for us, don't they? They pre-digest our food and convert it into chemicals that firstly we can absorb, and secondly that is the human active form. So we are a symbiotic organism, and I think the absence of some of these essential microbes, and this is a very new science, isn't it, or in
Extremely
terms of an
recent.
understood
Yeah.
science, the absence of them is critical, isn't it? Yeah.
And, I feel like in a lot of, again, with antibiotics and glyphosate and things like that, that are that are just wiping out
Mhm.
our microbiome. Like we don't even, a lot of modern people don't even have the strains to break down oxalates. So that we're seeing kidney stones and things. So yeah, our microbiome is so important, whether
Yes.
you have gut issues or not, taking care of your microbiome. And a big portion of that is food, but a lot of times it's even replacing certain strains. We now know that, people who struggle with weight gain and inability to lose weight despite how healthy they eat or how much they exercise are actually lacking certain strains of bacteria, probiotics in their gut. And, we're
Mm.
discovering what those are. And so there's brands out there that say this strain helps with weight loss, and you take it and you are all of a sudden able to metabolize and absorb nutrients and things like that. And everybody's like, "Oh, my stomach doesn't hurt. I don't need to worry about that." That's not how this works.
No, absolutely, and there's a lot of pharmaceutical drugs that actually greatly harm your microbiome. So you mentioned antibiotics. I mean, obviously they are antibiotic, anti-life. So, and there's a lot of evidence that people who've taken repeated courses of antibiotics have, a much less diverse gut microbiome, and they are then much more susceptible to other infections and also to other diseases, simply because their gut microbiome has changed. There's been human and animal studies where they can actually transplant the sort of, let's just say, bowel contents for now, and take them out of one animal and put them into the other, and the disease follows the transplanted bowel contents.
Yeah.
So you've got proof there. But there's so many other drug groups that are harmful to the microbiome. I mean,
Oh,
we've got proton pump inhibitors, PPIs, that are widely used for acid stomach, acid reflux, but they obviously they reduce the amount of acid in your stomach, but they greatly change the gut microbiome right through your body. They have lots of other unwelcome effects in the body as well, but they've very quickly changed the way your healthy microbes exist in your gut. Metformin, we've talked about. Metformin's used for type 2 diabetes, and I think it actually works by changing your gut microbiome anyway. So it reduces the availability of glucose. So if you eat a lot of sugar, the metformin changes the bugs in your gut, so that sugar isn't as available to you, and so therefore your blood sugar is reduced. That's actually how it works. So that one definitely changes your gut microbiome.
I did not know that.
Yeah, I think that. I mean, metformin's a poorly understood drug, but I think that's one of its mechanisms of actions. It actually changes your gut microbiome, in a way which is seen as helpful. Oh, well, that cake that you've just eaten is now not as full of sugar as it was because you've got different bugs that have eaten the sugar, because you take metformin. So, and that's been seen as a good thing. But of course, we've changed the gut microbiome. Um, there's so many other drug groups. I mean, you've had the morphine type painkiller crisis has gone around the Western world, and
Mhm.
Morphine type drugs, painkillers act to change the gut microbiome, as do anti-inflammatory drugs.
Yeah.
Like ibuprofen, they change the gut microbiome. Even things like antidepressant drugs, we've got SSRIs. It's like that they change the. I mean, most. Well, I'll say maybe I can't say most. Let's just say the receptors that we have in our gut, are actually very similar to the receptors we have in our brain. There's a very close link between the gut and the brain.
Right.
There's a direct link, the vagus nerve, and there's a lot of evidence that the bugs in our gut actually make hormones or make chemical messengers that signal to our brain. So we're actually listening to the bugs in our gut when we trust our intuition or our gut feeling. We all say gut feeling, don't we? Okay, so where does that come from?
Yeah.
So let's just say quite a lot of drugs that work on the brain probably will change the way your gut works as well, because there's that close linkage.
And I can think of people that are on so many drugs and antidepressants and all of that, and it just also makes me think about how there was that study in the 70s about schizophrenia and gluten, and how they removed gluten in 100% remission. They reintroduced gluten in 100% everybody became symptomatic and started having symptoms again. And
Yeah,
and so it's like, yeah, our outside world impacts our inside world so
absolutely.
much.
And
And
I learned about lectins. So
mhm,
yeah, you'll be familiar with lectins. So
yep.
gluten. So there's a group of plant tiny proteins called lectins, and gluten is one of them. And the plants use them basically as toxins, as poisons.
Mhm.
So plants don't want you to eat the bits of the plant that are about reproduction. So they don't want their seeds eaten, but they might want to let you eat their leaves in order to spread the seeds, but they don't really want the seeds to be eaten. So they put poisons in their seeds and the parts of the plants who don't want to eat them, but us to eat. But of course, we cook them and eat them anyway, and we're often told that they're good for us. But if they contain lectins, and we have gut dysbiosis, and that's progressed to leaky gut,
Mhm.
those lectins can get through the gut wall and into the blood, and they then become concentrated in our tissues, and then our own body starts to fight the poison, if you like, that's in our own tissues. And there's a lot of evidence that thyroid conditions, even things like Alzheimer's,
Mhm.
Parkinson's disease, there's a link to gut dysbiosis, to leaky gut, and to the presence of poisons, if you like, toxins in our food that have got into our bloodstream that would otherwise pass straight through us and be eliminated.
An autoimmune diet removes
Yeah.
lectins. That's like one of the big ones.
Yes.
And when we remove them, we see most autoimmune symptoms reverse quite quickly. I would say, depending on the age, the younger they are, we see 3 to 6 months. The older people are, when they
Mm.
become symptomatic, we're looking at anywhere from 9 to 18 months usually.
Yes. Yeah.
But yeah, so I wanted to throw that out there because a lot of my audience is struggling with chronic disease, autoimmune disease, and
Mm.
lectins are one of those groups that we want to minimize as much as possible because it
Absolutely.
does help with symptoms and making sure you start feeling better.
Yes. Yes. And I can personally attest to that. I was never gluten intolerant, but I believe I'm multiple lectin intolerant.
Hmm.
And that was something I discovered probably only about 5 or 6 years ago. And it's not taught in medical schools. Pharmacists don't know about it. The
Dietitians don't really know about it either.
no, no idea.
They're taught the food pyramid, whatever the government says is what they're taught.
Yeah.
And if you want to learn about actual health and how food actually impacts the body, you have to go outside and study yourself
Yeah.
and be willing to trust your gut when you're reading the
Mm.
studies. And, I've read books from all spectrums, from vegan to carnivore and everything in between. And I mean, really, the foundation is the thing that's the same as whole food. And then from there, it's a lot of bio individuality, I think.
Mm.
But there's certain foundational principles that just are universal no matter what. And if you're struggling with health, there's just certain foundational things. And if you're not struggling with health yet, you probably will if you're not following these foundational principles.
Yes, exactly. And as I've got my two children are in their 20s now, and I'm doing my very best to help them understand that the world they've grown up in is more toxic and less nutritious than the world I grew up in. So they've got to be on their guard and more careful than I had to be.
Yeah, it does require a lot more effort these days for sure. Let's talk about a little bit. Let's talk about let's wrap everything back together and talk about these foundational
Mm.
principles that what can people start doing today? You talked about your three things. Let's kind of review those again and maybe give people like really solid places to start.
Yeah, so the three things are the stress in your life, the presence of the right building blocks or nutrition, minerals, micronutrients, and the absence of toxins. So those are the three foundations. But I would add to that, as best as you can, live your life in tune with your environment. So the for those of us that live quite away from the equator, our seasons are very different in day length.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's where you're naturally from, then try as much as you can to live your life in tune with daylight. So eat. I'm a great fan of 1 meal a day or maybe 2 meals a day or a sort of narrow eating window. Don't see it as a restriction. I see it as opportunity for my body to rest and digest and recover outside of those times. So if I can eat in a 4 or 6 hour window, my body's got all those other hours in which to do the cleaning, clean out all the toxins and rest and recover. We can't all go to bed. I mean, here in the UK where I live, in the winter, it gets dark at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon and it doesn't get light till about 9 in the morning. And then in the summer, it's light at 3 in the morning and it doesn't get dark till about 11 o'clock at night. Now, I can't do that, but you can live a bit closer to those things, even if you're working. And it is hard if you're doing a night shift work or, you're working different shifts. I understand that. But if you can do something to move closer to the natural rhythms of the world where you live and the presence of daylight and try and be outside more in the daylight, be out there without sunglasses. I watch the sun at sunrise and sunset.
Mm-hmm.
I actually look directly at the sun and get the red light. I find that very therapeutic. I stand on the grass with bare feet as much as I can. I earth. I spend time in nature. So I think all of those are really important. Trying to eliminate blue light. I've definitely spent a lot of my time in front of computer screens, working. But only recently have I discovered, blue blocking glasses and the filters that you can have on the software that you can have on your computer to reduce the blue light.
Mm-hmm.
So I think those are some very simple things you can do. Just the blue blocking and absence of artificial light at night. Artificial light at night. Alan,
Mm-hmm.
I think is the way to remember it. So if you can minimize Alan in your life, that will, I think, go quite a long way to helping you start to move forward with your health. And then if you can be honest with yourself about the stresses in your life and just take little things, little steps, maybe once a week to either remove a stress or acknowledge the stress and then aim to find a way to minimize it. We can't all change our jobs overnight or move house, live in a different part of the city, etc. But we can all do a little bit, and I think it's just a slow, gradual, progressive change, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
That is sustainable. I'm a great believer in doing what's sustainable, even if it's slow. But aim for the things that you can sustain and make a routine for yourself. I think that would be one of my biggest tips for people.
Awesome. That's my tip too, is what's sustainable and a little bit at a time. I think especially here in America, we like go big or go home. It's all or nothing. And it's like, no, like what is one thing that you can focus on, whether it's this week or maybe for the whole month, depending on what you're tackling, and if
Mm-hmm.
it's like, I mean, blue light I feel like it's huge, right? And it's like can you download an app that where starting, at sunset, it's a blue light blocker. And on my computers, like I have the blue light filters. Like I'm not a photographer or anything, so I don't have to look at actual light, and
Yeah.
judge color. So I'm able to do that. And then I wear glasses, so my glasses have blue light blockers in them. My contacts,
Mm-hmm.
this is how they're made now. They have blue light blockers in them.
Yeah.
But then I take them off for the sun, right? Because we do need some
Mm.
blue light from outside,
Yes,
so
at
at
the
the
right
right
time
time
of
of
day.
day and all of that.
Mm.
And then everybody thinks they need these gadgets, right? Oh, I need the red lights, the little $2,000 bar where I have to sit in front of it.
Mm,
No, you can
mm,
watch the sunrise and the sunset. Does that mean you have to wake
yeah.
up and be intentional? Yeah, you're probably going to have to wake up,
Mm,
but the
mm,
payoff and just being outside all day, it gives your brain a break. It gives you a nature break. It makes you more effective. It reduces your stress. It actually improves your sleep. So it's
yes.
really simple things can have a huge impact in multiple areas. And I think that I love that you talked. It's just, you just need to do a little bit and
Mm,
build from there.
yeah. It's, every great journey begins with one step, doesn't it? As they
It's
say.
true.
So take that first step.
Well,
Mm.
thank you so much for joining us and just sharing so much valuable information and sharing your story. It's truly incredible and inspiring. And I can't wait to hear what people have to say. So if people wanted to connect with you or learn more about you and learn more about your story, how can they reach out to you or get to know you better?
Yeah, so I'm working with a lovely group of people. So when I first left the NHS, I was in a very vulnerable place, and I sought sanctuary really with a group of people who have written a book called The Red Pill Revolution, and I think you might have already spoken to a couple of the authors of that book. Is that
Yep.
right?
Yep, I've spoken to John Gusty. You're my second one, so we got more coming.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So along with John, there's Dr. Jeremy Ayres, who's a naturopathic consultant here in the UK, although he's lived and worked all around the world. And John and Jeremy have been amazing to me and taken me under their wing. So you can find me on the redpillrevolution.com. I've become known as the Red Pill Pharmacist,
That's awesome.
which is love. And then so I'm also working with Jeremy on another venture which is called Naturally Better. So you can find, I mean, Jeremy Ayres will share his links, I'm sure, but jeremyayres.com links to Naturally Better. So we are building a true health community because as we started, there is no health in healthcare, or there's very little health in healthcare. So let's go back to where health or what healthcare should really be. So you can find me on those websites, and then hopefully before too long, I'm currently writing two books. So I'm writing a book which is essentially my story intertwined with the history of medicine. So how did we come to live in an allopathic world? What happened? Where did it go so wrong? When did it go wrong? And who did it? So that's one book, and then the other book is, as you rightly indicated earlier on, there are some bits of the allopathic system that we would want to keep,
Hmm.
and a lot of the urgent care and trauma care is actually very good and very necessary, but an awful lot of the chronic long-term care is definitely not worth keeping. So my second book is about what do we keep and move on with, and what do we leave behind. That might well be a smaller book. I think the second book will be an easier read, a bit like a quick reference guide, if you like, and help people connect with this true health space that we live in now.
Hmm.
If people have put their GP, their consultant, their practitioner on a pedestal, that it's going to take some understanding for them to move away from that. And my aim is to reach the average person out there who's been a healthcare believer
Hmm.
and is starting to doubt. They're starting to become dissatisfied with the system. So that's my target population, if you like, because I've been doing talks, and I've done a few internet appearances, sort of TV internet TV appearances. But I know I'm talking to the converted, and I want
Yeah.
to reach the people who have been victims really of a system that they trusted, and that's my passion now. That's my goal. That's my mission for the next chapter in my life.
Well, I am so excited for you, and I can't wait for those books to come out because I'm
Mhm.
definitely going to be reading them. I am one of those that's broken free of the matrix, but I also have this goal of getting people who are dissatisfied, especially chronic illness. Modern medicine can do very little for you.
Mm,
And when there's so much in your power and in your control, and I feel like that's both of our missions is to let people know that they are in control of their health. And here are the
absolutely.
tools to get you there. It's just so powerful.
And it's not difficult.
It's not difficult. Change is hard, but it's not difficult. You
Not even
know,
a
and
word.
so thank you again so much for coming on.
I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. If you found this episode helpful, would you do me a favor and help others find it by leaving a review, sharing a screenshot on social media, or sharing the link with a friend? By you sharing what you've learned, others are able to find this podcast and join our community. Be sure to check out my website, www.roadtolivingwhole.com, for over 160 delicious recipes, a variety of meal plans, and a blog packed full of even more healthy living tips. If you'd like to learn more about how to work with me as your coach, you can schedule a free consult through www.roadtolivingwhole.com/health-coaching/. Until next time, friend. Bye.